Hello. This brief encounter is on driving. In my 10 years of driving in India, these are some things that I have realized and learned, and I hope they are of use and help to anybody who's just starting out. The first tip or advice that I would give is to practice in a stationary car. We will eventually be driving on the street, so it sounds pretty silly to practice in a stationary car. But it becomes very helpful because when we practice in a stationary car, we can focus on the functions we are to perform. Those functions, when we get comfortable enough with them, come to us like reflex. Reflex is a very strange, weighted, and significant word in driving because it implies that the important functions that you are supposed to perform become automatic to your body. And you do those functions, you carry out those functions, you perform those functions without thinking about them. And this makes driving on the street easier because then you don't have to think about what you're doing or what you're supposed to do. Your body, your muscle, and your mind has already memorized and learned, and it knows what to do in which situation. You see a car ahead of you that looks like it's going over a bump, and even though you're in a conversation with the person sitting on the passenger seat, you immediately squeeze the brake gradually. You know at which point you will need to press the clutch so that the car doesn't stop. If you can build reflex, that's going to be very, very helpful in driving. And practicing in a stationary car helps to build that. If we get on the street, before we are comfortable with performing important functions, we are going to get distracted because once we are on the street, there are so many things around us that are vying for our attention. Inside the car, outside the car, farther up ahead in front of two cars, checking your mirrors side and rear view. Not being comfortable enough, not being confident enough in what we are supposed to be doing to move the car itself is going to obstruct us and make driving seem like such a burden, such a task. On the other hand, if we are already well acquainted with the series of functions we are to perform in any given situation, sudden braking or shifting the gears up and down quickly, especially as it is required on the Indian streets, driving on the street is going to become much more easier for us. And at least the functions that we are supposed to perform, that's an aspect that we won't have to think about. We can focus our attention solely on what's happening on the street and whether there is anything that requires us to think ahead. My next advice or tip would be to learn on as large a car as one can get access to. Sometimes we limit ourselves to the car in which we have learned how to drive, or we limit ourselves to the size of the car in which we have learned to drive. If we learn to drive, if we learn how to drive in a large car, then it drives away our fear of it. And we are comfortable and we have the confidence to drive cars of any size. The same, I would say, is true of manual and automatic cars as well. People who have learned to drive on manual cars can drive automatic cars, but people who have learned driving on automatic cars find it difficult in adjusting to performing an extra function in manual cars of shifting gears. In the same way, if we learn on a large car, we have a better idea of space, we know how to park better, and when we move to a smaller car, these things seem easier to us. So if we can, should try to learn in as large a car as possible. Learning how to reverse park. I know most of us don't want to hear it, and even more of us don't want to deal with it, but it is perhaps the most essential sub skill a driver can have. Firstly, in itself, it is required because wherever we are, in whichever corner of the world, we are required to reverse park, if not today, tomorrow. Secondly, in practicing reverse parking, we develop other skills. For instance, we understand the full range of the steering, and it begins to feel like an extension of the arm itself, which in turn gives us a greater sense of control of the car. And when we feel that we have more control of the car, we become better drivers on the whole. Reverse parking is not only important because you will have to park in reverse, but practicing reverse parking develops a relationship between the driver and the car itself, which is not often talked about, but in my opinion, it is equally important. Next, get comfortable in shifting gears quickly. Again, this is not a tip, this is not an advice that is often talked about because we are so focused on just knowing how to press the clutch and shift a gear. But knowing being comfortable in shifting gears quickly is significant because of the state, because of the nature, because of the atmosphere of Indian streets, especially where we don't get a lot of reaction time. We may not get enough reaction time. And if we are too rigid about holding the steering wheel with both hands, we might hesitate, we might not want to leave the steering wheel and shift gears up or down, which can get us into trouble, especially when we are going uphill. So, and again, this links back to the previous points in which I've talked about developing greater relationship, developing a sense of control of the steering wheel. Because the more control we think we have on the steering wheel, the better we are able to maneuver even with one hand, and we can use the other to shift gears quickly when and if that is required. And this can be practiced in a stationary car or while actually driving on the street as well. My next tip would be to understand as much as possible about all the operations or functions that you are performing. It always helps when we know why we are doing what we are doing and what its consequence is going to be. For instance, the purpose of a car is to move from point A to point B. But why do we need the clutch for that? The accelerator moves the car forward, and the brake helps us with when we don't want it to move forward. So what does the clutch do? The clutch connects the engine of the car to the drivetrain. What is the drivetrain? The drivetrain is an assembly of components that transmits power from the engine to the wheels. So in essence, when we release the clutch is engaged. And when the clutch is engaged, power is being transmitted from the engine to the wheels. When we declutch, the clutch is disengaged, which means that there is no power transmission between the engine, from the engine to the wheels. Similarly, why do we need a handbrake when we already have a foot brake? The purpose of a handbrake is to ensure that the car remains motionless. This is required for when the car is parked on a slope, on a hill. Because when we use the foot brake, when we press it, then the rotation of the wheel is obstructed and the car comes to a halt. But when we release the foot brake, then the wheel is free and the car is free to move forward. When the car is parked on a slope, this can become dangerous because you can't keep the foot brake pressed when the car is parked. When the car is parked, nobody is pressing the foot brake. And that is why the handbrake is required, because it acts as a permanent brake lock on the front two wheels. Another tip that I would like to add, and it would be very unconventional, is to speak to someone who enjoys driving or somebody who is an experienced driver. When we are learning a skill and we reach out to someone who has a broader idea of the skill, who is more well versed in that skill or more experienced in that skill than we are, it enriches our learning experience. We gain new perspectives that we wouldn't otherwise, and it broadens our idea, our understanding of what that skill is. For instance, it is my personal belief that driving is not just about getting from one place to another. And I have come to believe it on the basis of those whom I learned how to drive from. I was surrounded by people who truly enjoyed driving, and they instilled this interest and love of driving in me as well. Like in all subjects, like in all fields, we are inspired and directed, and we take on the moods of the teacher who is teaching us the subject or the skill. The same is true for driving. However, we don't all get to choose our teachers. So if you have the opportunity of speaking to someone who enjoys driving, please do that, because they are going to offer you a perspective that will really broaden your understanding of what driving can be. And it won't feel like a burden, like a task anymore, which I know it sometimes can, because we're all driving through such tense environments, and especially for those who have to drive kilometers and kilometers for work, it can become really harassing and exhausting. My next tip is exclusively for women or girls who are learning to drive. Those who are experienced would not need me to tell this, but those who are still learning, those who are just beginning to learn, if you are a woman, if you are a girl, please drive with your windows rolled up. It is always safer, and no matter how much we wish to change the world, we need to keep our security in mind. And especially if we are learning, we are prone to being distracted easily, as it is with any other skill, with any other field. And to ensure that we are focused on what we are supposed to do, it's best if we keep distractions to a limit and let the world do whatever it wants to do, the way in which it wants to move, while we keep our concentration on what we are supposed to do. In my opinion, the deciding factor of whether we are proficient in a skill or not is how we approach the skill. If we look at it as an obligation, if we learn or if we want to learn, if we are learning how to drive simply because we have to, it's an obligation, everybody needs to know how to commute, then the learning process might be cumbersome, taxing, exhausting, and not fun at all. On the other hand, like in any other field of inquiry, if we approach it from a desire to learn, if we are interested in the field, that changes our outlook of the skill completely. That changes our relationship to the skill completely. And it doesn't seem like a task anymore. The learning process becomes fun, and we have a childlike curiosity and childlike enthusiasm with which we approach it, with which we approach every lesson and every failure. The most important thing, however, as it is with any other skill, so it is with driving, is to practice with an experienced driver beside you. Please have an experienced teacher guiding you when you are learning how to drive, and even after you have learned how to drive. It is extremely important that we take care not only of our own safety, but the safety of everybody else on the street as well. Because let's remember, the car is a machine and it doesn't go out of control unless we make a mistake. And when we are driving on the street, our mistake not only has consequences for us, but everybody else around us as well, in the same way that somebody else's mistake has a consequence or might have a consequence on us too, which is why we need to be so vigilant when we are driving. It's not just about whether we know what we are supposed to do, but our attention towards what is happening around us outside the car, on the lanes beside us, on the lanes opposite the street. If you found this video helpful, please subscribe. Thank you so much for watching.